Miss Marple and the Silence Under the Church Bells, Chapter 1, Sunday Tea and the Missing Sound. The bell of St. Mildred's Church, that ancient cracked bronze bell that had rung every Sunday for over a century, remained silent that morning. For most of the parishioners in the quiet village of Crowsden, it was a minor detail, a mechanical failure, perhaps a broken rope, or the forgetfulness of some absent-minded sexton. But for Miss Jane Marple, sitting by the window of her small house on Elm Lane, it was like a discordant note in a score she knew only too well. "How curious," she murmured, placing her teacup halfway to her lips. "Mr. Pembroke never fails in his duty." It was a mild spring morning, with the scent of lilacs drifting through the open window, and the rustling of leaves stirred by a light breeze. Crowsden was in full swing, preparing for its traditional hydrangea festival, an event that brought the entire community together, with cakes, tea, gardening prizes, and, of course, the eagerly awaited jam-making competition. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual grey wool ensemble and faded plumed hat, decided to attend Sunday service, even without the ringing of the bells. As she walked slowly along the cobblestones, she noticed the small signs that had always revealed great truths. Mrs. Redgrave's drawn curtain, a sign that she hadn't slept well, the vicar's uncut lawn, a sign of possible domestic tension, and the silence, a silence that wasn't entirely natural. The church filled slowly. The vicar, Reverend Ellis, took the pulpit with a nervous expression. The homily was short and rambling. He didn't mention the bell, nor did he mention the absent face of the sexton, Harold Pembroke. It was only after the service, during the tea held in Mrs. Langford's garden, that the gossip began. "Have you noticed Mr. Pembroke's absence?" Mrs. Featherstone said, lowering her voice as if her comment contained venom. "At his age, maybe he just fell asleep," Miss Hartnell suggested with a shrug. "Asleep?" Mrs. Redgrave snorted. "That man has been opening the church for 36 years. He has more discipline than a Swiss watch." Miss Marple listened, as always, in silence. Her gaze wandered into the shadows cast by the trees on the lawn. A small detail, one she couldn't quite place, caused her a subtle but persistent unease. It was as evening fell when Inspector Rowntree arrived at the Langfords' garden, with a determined stride that the atmosphere became more tense. "Forgive the interruption," he said gravely. "Has anyone seen Mr. Harold Pembroke since yesterday afternoon?" Silence fell like a slab. The teacups hung in the air. Their gazes, previously scattered and distracted, now focused on one another, as if for the first time recognizing themselves in a different scene. Miss Marple said nothing. She just watched as Mrs. Featherstone unnoticed a drop of tea fell onto her blouse, as Reverend Ellis shifted his gaze toward the hedge, and as the young festival gardener, James Eddowes, stiffened imperceptibly at the mention of the sexton's name. It was the beginning, and as Miss Marple knew well, in towns like Crowsden, beginnings were rarely what they seemed. Chapter 2. The Empty Pulpit and the Key That Wasn't Where It Should Be. The rumour spread through Crowsden as quickly as a wildfire through dry bushes. By Sunday afternoon, there wasn't a house in the village where Harold Pembroke's name wasn't whispered with growing anxiety. Some said they had seen him on the way to the bell tower the previous evening, Others swore they heard a slam in the church door at dusk, but none could confirm having seen him that morning. Miss Marple, back home after tea at the Langfords, took mental notes while leisurely watering her begonias. It was her way of organising her thoughts and also of letting her memory, sharp as ever, identify what others missed. At 3 o'clock, Inspector Rowntree knocked on her door. He knew her well, not only from the cases she had discreetly helped solve in the past, but also because, despite her age and gentle appearance, Jane Marple saw things that others missed. "Miss Marple," he said, hat in hand, looking tired, "may I have a few minutes of your time?" "Of course, Inspector. A cup of tea, perhaps. I would appreciate it." As she poured with firm hands and measured movements, he reviewed the basic information. Mr. Pembroke hadn't been seen since the previous evening. His house was locked from the inside, his bed unmade, and his coat hanging on the coat rack. No signs of a struggle, but no sign of a departure either. "And the church?" Miss Marple asked, serving 2 gingerbread cookies. "The side door, the one that leads to the chestnut alley, was secured from the inside. Only Mr. Pembroke had the key to the bell tower, or so we thought." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That last point was no small feat. In towns like Crowsden, people took many things for granted, and few were ever thoroughly examined. "Have they searched the bell tower?" "We tried, but the trap-door leading to the bell tower is padlocked, and we haven't found the key." A silence fell between them. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. Her eyes slid toward the china clock on the mantelpiece, whose hands seemed to stand still for a moment. "Inspector," he said finally, "do you know if Mr. Pembroke had any particular routine on Saturday afternoons?" Rowntree frowned. He took a small notebook out of his pocket. "I used to walk Mrs. Redgrave's dog on Saturdays at 5. According to her, she didn't do it yesterday." "So he's been missing ever since," Miss Marple muttered, "and yet no one thought to look for him until the bell rang." Rowntree nodded uncomfortably. "If I may, Inspector," Miss Marple continued, "I'd like to accompany you this afternoon. I'd like to have a look at the church." The inspector hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He knew that refusing his help was, at best, a symbolic gesture, at worst, an unforgivable blunder. They walked together toward St. Mildred's under a leaden sky, the wind blowing cherry blossom petals along the edges of the tombstones in the old cemetery. The church, with its dark stone tower and weathered, stained-glass windows, seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the atmosphere was cool, slightly humid, and the scent of old wood permeated every corner. "The trapdoor is up there, behind the altar," Rowntree pointed out. Miss Marple stopped halfway down the aisle. Her eyes scanned the wooden pews, the pulpit, the cloth-covered organ, and the large dangling rope that was usually used to ring the bell. This time it hung limply, as if also waiting for a signal. She approached the trap-door, where the inspector was waiting for her. The rusty padlock was still in place. "And the key?" "We've searched the sacristan's house, his pockets, his coat rack, even the sacristy drawers. Nothing." Miss Marple looked at the lock. Then she looked around, her eyes resting for a few seconds on a shelf of hymnals. Without saying a word, she walked towards it. He opened one at random, and there, between the pages, he found something unexpected. A cardboard card with a handwritten inscription in tight letters. The truth weighs more when silence sounds. Mrs. Marple said nothing. She just gently closed the book, as if returning something sacred to its place. "Inspector," he said calmly, "it seems to me this bell fell because of more than just a broken rope." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked off into the sunset. Chapter 3. Between Hymnals and Murmurs. Night fell over Crowsden like a thick blanket, and with it a subtle unease seeped through the cracks in the well-ordered houses. Despite the usual silence that reigned in the village after 8 o'clock, that night doors were heard closing earlier than usual, curtains being quietly drawn, and low voices that avoided a casual tone. Harold Pembroke's disappearance had sparked more than curiosity. It had disrupted the familiar rhythm of the village, like a mistuned note in a well-rehearsed melody. In Mrs. Redgrave's house, the parlour lamp was still lit. Sitting in her upholstered armchair, a handkerchief in one hand and her white cat in the other, she stared at the grandfather clock as if waiting for something. "It's absurd," he murmured. "Harold wouldn't have run away. He had no reason. None." Across the village, in the small lodgings of young James Eddowes, the festival's volunteer gardener, a more tense conversation was taking place behind a closed window. James was speaking on the phone, his voice strained. "I told you it wasn't the time. Someone could have seen. No, not yet. Just wait." He hung up with a sigh and slumped into a chair, staring at a pair of gloves covered in fresh dirt, forgotten by the door. Meanwhile, Miss Marple lit her reading lamp and mentally reviewed the day's events. Her notebook, covered in floral fabric, lay open on the table. In it she had jotted down in her neat handwriting, "Hymn book, message on cardboard, who would have access?" There was something about that phrase, "The truth weighs most when it's silent," that seemed not a threat but a warning, and the choice of hiding place, a hymnal in the church, was no accident. It was, as Miss Marple used to say, a place no one would think to look, except someone who had something to hide. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on his door. It wasn't common to receive visitors at that hour. He calmly stood up and opened it. It was the vicar, Reverend Ellis. "Sorry it's late, Miss Marple," he said with an uncomfortable expression. "I know it's late, but there's something I must tell you. Not to the police, at least not yet." Miss Marple cocked her head like a curious bird. "Would you like to come in, Reverend?" He entered, still wearing his hat. He seemed agitated. He walked to the edge of the carpet, but didn't sit down. "You see, there's something I didn't mention at church today. I didn't want to upset the congregation further. But yesterday afternoon, while I was preparing the festival flyers, I heard voices inside the bell tower." "You?" An argument, very brief. "A man." And another voice I couldn't clearly identify. I thought it was Harold, maybe talking to someone. But then I heard a dry metallic noise, as if something heavy had fallen. Miss Marple clasped her hands. "And you didn't go see?" "I got scared, and I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe part of the mechanism. The bell tower can sound strange when the wind changes. But now I'm not so sure. Have you told this to anyone else? Just you?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Something didn't add up. If the Reverend had really heard voices, why wait until late at night to speak? fear, or perhaps something else. Thank you for coming, Reverend. You did well to tell me, he finally said. That detail, however small it may seem, could be important. She walked him to the door. Before leaving, he turned around. Do you think something terrible has happened? Oh, I don't like to be hasty, Reverend, but I have the impression that someone at Crowsden is relying too much on the bell not ringing. Once alone, Miss Marple returned to her notebook. She jotted down a new line. Voices in the bell tower, metallic fall, doubting witness. Outside, the wind began to blow harder. The branches of the apple tree in the garden scratched the window with a soft but insistent tapping. In the church tower, the bell rope remained motionless, as if waiting for its moment to break the silence. And under the bells, still hidden by the padlocked trapdoor, something or someone waited to be found. Chapter 4. An Old Lock and Too Many Keys. The next morning dawned with grey skies and a fine rain that seemed to envelop the village in a perpetual mist. The hydrangeas, so proudly tended for the festival, now hung limp, soaked with dew and a tension that seemed to penetrate the soil to its very roots. In the square, a few neighbours spoke quietly under their umbrellas. No one directly mentioned Harold Pembroke's disappearance, but everyone knew. In towns like Crowsden, secrets were wrapped in pleasantries, and suspicions were served with tea-cakes. Miss Marple, sheltered under a lace-trimmed umbrella, walked toward the church. She was going to meet Inspector Rowntree, who had requested a second search of the bell tower, this time with the help of a locksmith who could open the padlock without damaging it, in case it was evidence, he had said. When he arrived, he found the inspector already waiting by the side entrance, with the figure of a short, stocky man crouching by the lock. Miss Marple, Rowntree greeted her, a little more sombrely than usual. This is Mr. Birkett, our local locksmith. He says this type of lock isn't exactly modern. No, miss, Birkett chimed in, his voice raspy. This model is from the 1920s, difficult to break into without the right key, but not impossible to open with the right method. While Birkett worked on the lock of the trapdoor leading to the bell tower, Miss Marple let her gaze wander over the altar, the stained glass windows dull from the lack of light and the dust accumulating on the candlesticks. Everything seemed more abandoned than she remembered. A sharp click broke the silence. The padlock fell to the floor with a muffled clink. Rowntree nodded to one of the officers accompanying him, and the young man went up first, followed by the inspector. Miss Marple waited below, her hands folded over her bag, her eyes fixed on the bell rope descending from above. "Oh, my God!" the agent's voice came from above. Miss Marple looked up. In the silence that followed, she knew for sure what they had found. Minutes later, Rowntree descended, his face white and his jaw clenched. It's there, Harold Pembroke's body, on the floor of the bell tower, next to the pulley. A blow to the head, possibly caused by a metal tool. Any signs of a struggle? Miss Marple asked calmly. Not apparent. Everything very orderly. As if it had been placed there. Mrs. Marple didn't reply immediately. She was staring at the open trapdoor as if she could see beyond the wood. Then she turned to Rowntree. And the key to the padlock. She's not with him. And are there other copies of that key? Rowntree rubbed the back of his neck. Officially, just one. Harold kept it on his personal keychain, but now even that keychain has disappeared. So someone else had access, or made a copy. Do you think anyone had a motive? Miss Marple turned toward the altar, where a bouquet of fresh flowers, surely placed by someone on the festival committee, rested in a vase. A striking contrast to the darkness of the rest of the church. "Inspector," he said thoughtfully, "I've learned that when someone disappears, and they do so in a sacred place, it's not an impulsive act." Chapter 5. A Letter, a Garden, and Too Many Coincidences. The discovery of Harold Pembroke's body completely altered Crowston's pulse. Although there was no overt talk of murder, a word that still sent shivers down the spine when whispered, in the market or the bakery, the fact that the sexton had been found dead in the bell tower, with the bell deliberately silenced, left little room for benign explanations. The police kept the church closed while they inspected the site, but rumours were already spreading. It was said that Harold had discovered something, that he had received a strange letter days earlier, that he had had an argument in the rectory, and even that young James Eddowes had threatened him over a disagreement related to the festival. Preparations, Mrs. Hartnell, the owner of the wool shop, was the one who brought Miss Marple the latest information. They say they found a note between the pages of Harold's Bible, a note that wasn't there before, she said, wrapping a sky-blue ball of yarn with trembling hands. The police haven't said what it says, but the vicar went pale when he saw it. Miss Marple thanked her for the conversation and for the free ball of yarn, and walked leisurely home. The sun, timidly, was beginning to creep through the clouds, and with it a subtle light illuminated details that others still couldn't see. Upon arrival, he noticed something unusual. A letter without a postmark had been left in his mailbox. It was addressed simply to Miss Marple, in thin, slanted handwriting. He opened it carefully, sitting at his desk to read it carefully. Don't trust what everyone thinks they know. It wasn't just the bell that needed to be kept quiet. He knew too much, and now I do too. They're watching me, but you'll know what to do. There was no signature, just an initial. C. Miss Marple read it 3 times, each time more slowly. Whoever had written it was afraid, yes, but also clear-headed enough to trust her not. The police. And what could Harold Pembroke possibly know that was worth such silence? She tucked the note into the pages of her flowery notebook and stood up, heading out into the garden. Her mind, working like a silent loom, began to weave together threads that still seemed loose. The handwritten note in the hymnal, the voices in the bell tower, the missing key, and now an anonymous letter. While pruning a withered branch from her oldest rose bush, she looked up when she heard footsteps on the path. It was young James Eddowes. He was carrying a basket of gardening tools and wore a relaxed expression. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted with a small smile. "I was wondering if you still needed help with the hedge at the back. I thought with so much going on in the village, you might prefer not to go out too much." Miss Marple watched him kindly, though with more attentive eyes than James would have supposed. "How kind of you, James. While I don't need help with the hedge, there is something you might be able to clarify for me." He seemed to tense, barely perceptibly. "Yeah. Did you know that Mr. Pembroke had received an anonymous note days before he disappeared?" The young man frowned. "No, I didn't know. What did it say?" "That's the funny thing," said Miss Marple, leisurely turning a flower pot on the gardening table. "I don't know for sure yet. But you were near the bell tower on Saturday afternoon, weren't you?" James opened his mouth, but closed it immediately. He ran a hand through his dirt-stained hair. I did pass by, yes. I was checking. Some tools we used to put up the festival fences. I left a shovel in the vestry. Why do you ask?" "Curiosity," she said gently. "You know, things tend to fall into place if you listen long enough." James looked puzzled. Then he pursed his lips, gave a brief, polite nod, and left. Chapter 6. The Closed Bible and the Sermon Never Given. St. Mildred's Rectory was one of the oldest houses in Crowsden, with ivy-covered stone walls and an air of perpetual melancholy that even the warmest summer couldn't soften. That day, under a mist that blurred the silhouettes in the garden, the house seemed even more isolated, as if withdrawing into itself, hiding more than it revealed. Reverend Ellis greeted Miss Marple with his usual composure, although his eyes seemed somewhat more sunken, his expression less serene. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," he said, opening the door with both hands, as if clinging to a learned gesture of cordiality. "Would you like to come into the living room? My wife is in the kitchen preparing tea." "Thank you, Reverend," Miss Marple replied, strolling in. "But I'd rather speak to you, privately, if you don't mind." He nodded slowly and led her to the small study overlooking the back garden. It was a modest room, with shelves full of religious books, an armchair by the window, and a table with the parish Bible open, or almost. That thick volume with worn covers was half open, as if it had been consulted and then put down in a hurry. "Hope I'm not bothering you," she began, taking a seat, "but I was wondering if I could ask you something directly." The Reverend sat down opposite her. A slight trembling in his knee betrayed his nervousness. "Sure. About Harold?" Miss Marple inclined her head pleasantly. "Yes. I've heard that a note was found inside your Bible. I was wondering if you had a chance to read it." Ellis hesitated. He looked down at the book as if it were a stone resting on his conscience. "No, not carefully. It was the police who found it between the pages of the Gospel of Mark. It was folded in 4. It simply said, 'I heard everything. I won't allow it.' And then a cross drawn on it. No signature." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And do you think that note was written by Harold?" "Hard to say. It was his personal Bible, but he also frequently left it open on the altar. Others may have had access. Although Harold was a discreet man. Reserved. He didn't say more than necessary." Mrs. Marple looked closely at the Reverend's face. "And yet, you said you heard voices in the bell tower. Have you considered whether those voices could have been discussing something Harold knew?" Ellis swallowed. "I've thought about a lot of things, Miss Marple. Perhaps more than I should. But you know what really worries me? That Harold didn't ring the bell that Sunday. That was his sacred trust. If he didn't do it, it was because something or someone stopped him." The old woman nodded regretfully. That certainty weighed on everyone's mind, but for her it became a clue. "Would you mind if I took a look at the Bible?" "Come in," he said, stepping away. Miss Marple walked over carefully flipped through the thick pages and stopped right at the spot where the note had been found. There, between chapters 13 and 14 of Mark, she noticed a faint, smudge-like mark, as if a wet finger had pressed against the margin. A mark of haste, but that wasn't what was most striking. A few lines above, underlined in a barely perceptible pencil, were clearly legible in the correct light. And not one stone will be left upon another. Every stone will be thrown down. Miss Marple stood still. The passage wasn't innocent. It was a verse that spoke of destruction, of inevitable revelations. Had Harold deliberately marked it? "Reverend," he asked quietly, "has there been any argument in the parish recently about land use, the rectory, or financial matters?" Ellis raised an eyebrow. "How do you know?" "I don't know," she replied with a faint smile. "But I guess so. And in a town like this, where every corner has a history, money and tradition rarely go hand in hand." The vicar stood up, walked to the window, and spoke without looking at it. The festival committee proposed installing a new structure next to the church, an events pavilion, funded by an anonymous donation. Harold objected. He said the site was sacred, that the ground should not be touched. And others disagreed? Yes, some quite strongly. James Edhouse, for example. He was the one who submitted the plans, and he hesitated for a moment. So was Mrs. Redgrave. She oversees the parish funds. She was in favour firmly. Miss Marple assimilated the information with a slight nod. "Thank you, Reverend. That was very enlightening." As we stepped outside, the fog began to dissipate, revealing the gravestones in the cemetery next to the church more clearly. There, among the worn names and withered flowers, a truth seemed to silently grow. And Miss Marple, like so many times before, knew that some answers lay not in the screams, but in the whispers among the dead and the bells that no longer rang. Chapter 7. The Pavilion, Hydrangeas, and the Tea-Knife. Wednesday afternoon arrived with a pale sky and an imperceptible tension that permeated every interrupted conversation, every shorter-than-usual greeting. The Hydrangea Festival was still, scheduled, albeit with less enthusiasm. The decorations were half up, and the flowers were beginning to droop without the constant care that, under normal circumstances, would have been proudly lavished on them. No one was saying it out loud, but the still unsolved crime hung over the event like a heavy cloud. Miss Marple, who had decided to attend the organising committee's preparatory meeting, more to listen than to participate, arrived at the community hall with her usual punctuality. She was greeted by Mrs. Redgrave, impeccably dressed, and with her face carefully composed for the occasion. "Jane, darling," he said with a smile that barely touched his eyes, "it's so nice to see you. We're just finishing up the list of jam exhibitors." "A more complex matter than it seems," Miss Marple replied gently. "Real competitions always are." Mrs. Redgrave laughed, albeit somewhat stiffly. In the centre of the room, James Edhouse was supervising the placement of folding tables, marking out spaces with a tape measure. His shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the cool air. "Is everything all right, James?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, ma'am, although some are cancelling. They say the atmosphere isn't right for festivals," she replied quietly. Mrs. Redgrave pursed her lips. "Superstitions. The best thing we can do is continue. Show unity. We won't let one tragedy unravel years of tradition." Miss Marple didn't reply, just stood for a moment in front of the utensil table, where a set of silver knives had been carefully arranged for pie-eating competitions. Her eyes fell on one of them, longer, with a slight curve to the blade. There was an uneven cut in the wooden handle, as if someone had tried to erase a mark. "Is this a new knife, Margaret?" he asked innocently. "Which one?" "Oh, that one." "I don't think so. It must be one of the old ones. It was stored in the church storeroom until this morning. Interesting. The handle looks like it's been sanded recently." "Really?" Mrs. Redgrave replied, glancing at the object with feigned indifference. "I suppose one of the boys wanted to fix it. They're a bit clumsy, but well-intentioned." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Rowntree, whose presence caused an immediate silence. "I won't interrupt too much," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "I just needed to confirm with the organisers if any of you were at the church warehouse between Friday and Sunday morning." "I was there Saturday afternoon," James chimed in, raising his hand in obvious discomfort. "I went to drop off some tools and check out some structures. I didn't see anything out of place." Mrs. Redgrave also raised her voice. "I was there briefly, Friday morning. I left some tablecloths and checked the knives to make sure nothing was missing." Rowntree nodded, expressing no opinion. "Thanks. We're just trying to reconstruct a timeline. Any detail, no matter how small, could help." When the inspector left, the meeting resumed with less enthusiasm. Miss Marple, without another word, headed for the door. But before leaving, she passed James and paused for only a few seconds. "You know, dear, I've always been intrigued by how a tool is chosen. Not by what it does, but by what it's not supposed to do." James looked at her blankly, but Miss Marple was already walking under the overcast sky, her step calm and her mind in full swing. That night at home, he unfolded the anonymous note he'd received and read it again. Then he looked on his bookshelf for a small brochure about the festival from 3 years ago. He opened it to the Anonymous Donors section and underlined a name no one had ever noticed. CR, an initial, the same as on the letter. Coincidence? In Crowsden, coincidences were as rare as open confessions. And like freshly pruned hydrangeas, the truth only blossomed when someone cared for it long enough to watch it grow. Chapter 8. The Anonymous Donor and the Lost Notebook. Victor Dole. Day dawned shrouded in a mist that softened the contours of the houses, trees and faces. It was as if Crowsden didn't want to fully reveal itself, as if something or someone wanted to remain hidden for a few more hours. Miss Marple, however, was immune to meteorological distractions. After a frugal breakfast, she took out the old festival brochure and compared it with the most recent ones. There was the mysterious entry in small print again. CR, Special Donor of the Activities Pavilion. There was something unsettling about that coincidence, not only because the initials matched the anonymous letter she'd received, but because, as she well knew, anonymous donors were rarely completely anonymous. There was always a reason behind the silence: evasion of public recognition, compromised, ties, or something more calculated. In the middle of the morning, he leisurely made his way to the town hall archives, a tiny, poorly ventilated building at the end of Walnut Street, Mr. Weatherby, an archivist for 23 years, was there, serving him with the energy of an old cat who refused to leave his favourite chair. "Festival donors?" he repeated, adjusting his glasses. "Oh, yes, I have the lists, of course, although not all of them are complete. There was one year when the committee insisted on handling certain names discreetly. You know Mrs. Redgrave's character?" "I'm afraid I know," said Miss Marple, with a faint smile. "But if you could look at the list of donations from 3 years ago, and perhaps the committee minutes." Weatherby rummaged through yellowed folders, muttering to himself, and after a few minutes handed her a thin notebook with a faded blue cover. It contained handwritten notes, many in black ink, others in pencil. On the back cover, a note written in small, neat handwriting caught Miss Marple's eye. "CR. Amount reserved for works adjacent to the church. Verbally agreed upon with HP. HP. Harold Pembroke." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. If Harold had agreed to something involving that donor, it meant that at some point he knew who he was. Perhaps he'd even begun to suspect something, and that suspicion was what sealed his fate. "May I make a copy of this, Mr. Weatherby?" "Of course, but if I may comment, in this town, the things that aren't written down are usually more interesting than the ones that are." Miss Marple nodded with a significant look. Sometimes an omission revealed more than an entire confession. That afternoon, while walking along the path that bordered the cemetery, he met Inspector Rowntree again, who was coming from the church. "Inspector," he greeted him. "Any news?" Rowntree exhaled with some annoyance. "Nothing conclusive. We found partial prints in the bell tower, but they were too blurry. However, something interesting did turn up. A pocket notebook behind the organ. We're analysing it, although someone tore out the first few pages. Whose was it? It doesn't have a name, but there are notes that look like Harold's. Bible quotes, dates, and random phrases. On one page he wrote, 'It's not just dirt. It's buried memory.'" Miss Marple stopped. "What page is that?" "Number 7. Why?" "Because 7 was the number of the pew where Harold used to sit every Sunday, right in front of the organ. I wonder if that note didn't speak only of a physical realm." Rowntree seemed to think about it for a moment. "Do you think he meant something is buried, literally, or figuratively?" Miss Marple replied. "But in any case, the land seems to be the centre of this story." As they were talking, a sound interrupted them. Hurried footsteps, and then the agitated figure of Mrs. Redgrave coming from the street with a disturbed expression. "Inspector, please," he exclaimed upon arriving. "You have to come. It's James. He just turned up, injured. He says someone attacked him in the garden shed." In less than a minute, the two of them followed Mrs. Redgrave toward the house, where James Eddowes lay in a porch chair, with a slight wound on his arm and a nervous look. There was blood on his shirt, and a shovel lay at his feet. "I don't know who it was," he said, his voice cracking. "I was digging at the edge of the shed, trying to fix the base, and someone hit me from behind. I didn't see it." "Why were you digging there, James?" Rowntree asked firmly. James hesitated. "It's just... I found something. A fragment of what looked like a keychain, like the one Harold used. I thought I'd let you know, but someone surprised me first." Miss Marple bent down, picked up the shovel, and peered at the wet mud clinging to the metal. There was something other than dirt. a leather strap, barely visible among the debris. The silence that followed was dense, heavy like the clouds that now covered the town. And in Miss Marple's mind, another line was added to the list. The earth holds more than it promises, and someone is still digging to make sure it stays that way. Chapter 9. A Chain in the Mud and a Badly Buried Lie. The discovery of the chain in the Redgrave's garden marked a turning point. The object, although covered in mud and with several broken rings, was clearly in everyday use. Inspector Rowntree immediately identified it as similar to the one Harold Pembroke often carried with him, along with the bell tower key and the vestry keys. James Eddowes, his arm still bandaged, remained silent as the police collected the fragment and searched the ground for more remains. His face, usually sun-tanned, was now pale, and he avoided meeting glances with both the inspector and Miss Marple, who watched from a prudent distance like someone who has already read the ending of a novel but is waiting for others to discover it for themselves. Mrs. Redgrave, for her part, seemed more nervous than usual. She paced back and forth, offering tea to the officers, asking every 10 minutes if the security cordon could be removed, and feigning concern with a theatricality that Miss Marple found excessive. It was while they were helping James into the house that the old woman approached with a soft voice. "James, would you mind if I asked you a question?" He looked at her, unsure, but nodded. "You said someone attacked you while you were digging, right?" Yeah, it was fast. I didn't even see it coming." "And why did you decide to dig right there?" James hesitated. "It was the base of the shed. It was giving way. I thought the moisture might be damaging the foundation. And you found the chain by accident." "Yes, it was in the dirt. It was barely visible." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "So your attacker would have arrived just as you found her. What an extraordinary coincidence, don't you think?" James blinked. He didn't respond. That evening, Miss Marple returned home with the air of someone who had already put together enough pieces, but was waiting for the rest to fall into place. She sat by the fireplace and went over the names in her flowery notebook once more. Harold Pembroke, murdered. James Eddowes, gardener, discovered the chain. Miss Redgrave, fund supervisor, pavilion advocate. Reverend Ellis heard voices in the bell tower. Took a while to confess. Anonymous donor, CR, and then he returned to the note he'd received days earlier. One line stood out with renewed clarity. "Don't trust what everyone thinks they know." What if that note wasn't just a warning, but a veiled confession? The next morning, Miss Marple asked to see Inspector Rowntree. She found him in his office, looking over documents with a frown. "Inspector," he said as he entered, "I think it's time to consider a detail that has so far gone unnoticed." "And what would that detail be, Miss Marple?" "That Harold's body wasn't hidden. It was placed carefully, not buried, not hidden, just elevated, symbolically silenced. That's not what someone who kills on impulse or in panic does. It's what someone who wants to send a message, and at the same time protect something." Rowntree put down his pen. "Do you think Harold was blackmailing someone?" "No, I think Harold was threatening to reveal something. Something to do with the church grounds, the pavilion, the donation, and most importantly, the past." Miss Marple walked over to the desk and slid over a sheet of paper. It was a copy of the committee's minutes from 3 years ago. The anonymous donor's signature appeared in the margin, a careless gesture. But Miss Marple had recognized the handwriting. Rounded, very precise. "Do you recognize that signature?" Rowntree looked at her. Then he nodded grimly. "C. Redgrave, Miss," Marple sighed. "And now the question is, how far would Mrs. Redgrave go to keep her name hidden?" That afternoon, as the inspector was preparing to formally question Mrs. Redgrave, Miss Marple again passed the shed where the chain had been found. There, amid the disturbed earth and the grass that tried to hide the disturbance, he noticed something else, a small dark grey scrap of fabric caught on a root. He picked it up carefully and mentally compared it to the coat Margaret Redgrave had worn on Saturday. Exactly that shade, exactly that texture. A soft breeze crossed the garden. Miss Marple, without needing to say it out loud, knew that the cloth wasn't lying, and that the chain, more than an object, was a mark. Proof that what had been buried was beginning to surface. Chapter 10. Things Not Said Out Loud. When Margaret Redgrave walked through the doors of the community hall that morning, she did so as always. Back straight, lips perfectly lined, and a stride that left no room for doubt. But for those who knew how to look, like Miss Marple, there was a slight change in her rhythm, a tension in her shoulders, a shadow under her eyes, a blinking too quickly when she met inquisitive glances. The hall, which that morning was hosting the last meeting before the Hydrangea Festival, buzzed with an unusual energy. No one directly mentioned Harold Pembroke, but his absence hovered between every decorated cake and floral arrangement, redolent of escape. The recent appearance of the chain and the alleged attack on James Eddowes had heightened suspicion into a kind of social fog, and at the centre of it all, like a carefully framed figure, was she. Miss Marple arrived minutes later, leaning on her walking stick, more out of habit than necessity, and took a seat near the table where the day's duties were being handed out. Margaret barely acknowledged her. Perhaps she had stopped seeing her as a threat, or perhaps she saw her too much. The meeting was brief, almost ceremonial. Schedules were discussed, competitions were confirmed, and then, as the group dispersed, Rowntree appeared in the doorway. He was carrying his hat, and his voice was deeper than usual. "Mrs. Redgrave, may I speak to you? In private?" A slight blink, a barely perceptible gesture of the fingers, then a nod. "Of course, Inspector." Miss Marple watched them walk out of the drawing-room into the small side corridor that led to the garden. She couldn't hear them, but she didn't need to. She knew the questions that would come, and she also knew the answers Margaret would choose not to give. A few minutes later, the inspector returned. Mrs. Redgrave was not with him. "Where is she?" Miss Marple asked softly. Rowntree sat down next to her with a sigh. "He said he needed air." He walked toward the church. "And have you asked him about the donation?" "Yes. At first he denied everything. But when I showed him the copy of the report, he didn't deny it, but he didn't explain it either. He just said, 'I didn't kill Harold,' a phrase that always raises more suspicions than it dispels," Miss Marple observed. "Did he mention the network to you?" He said he'd never seen that key in his life. And the fabric cut. He recognized him. He said he was in the shed Saturday afternoon, that maybe he got hooked without realizing it. And you believed her? Rowntree looked at her doubtfully. I want to. But there are too many half-truths, and in this case, too many reasons to silence someone like Harold. Miss Marple nodded. Do you know what I find most revealing about all this? What thing? That Mrs. Redgrave hasn't cried. She hasn't shown a single genuine emotion since the sexton's death. No fear, no grief, just control. And in my experience, Inspector, absolute control usually comes not from innocence, but from practice. Hours later, Miss Marple headed to the church. She found it empty, the lights off, and a silence that wasn't religious, but defensive. She walked down the centre aisle, letting her footsteps echo off the walls. There, in the darkness, he saw her. Margaret Redgrave sat in the 7th pew, the same one Harold used to sit in. She had her hands folded in her lap and stared unblinkingly down. The altar. Miss Marple approached cautiously, saying nothing at first. Then she gently sat down beside him. Were you expecting someone, Margaret? No one. Or maybe myself, she replied, her voice lower than usual. This is where Harold used to sit, you know. Always at the same time. Always with that look on his face like someone carrying something he hasn't said in years. Like so many in Crowston, said Miss Marple. A long silence. Then Margaret spoke. I didn't kill him. It wasn't me. But I know why he was killed. And I don't know if that makes me any different. Miss Marple didn't reply. She just waited. Harold found out about the land. The deed from 1878. The land where they want to put the pavilion now. It's consecrated as a cemetery. It was briefly used during the plague of 1911. Forgotten documents, no one looked for them, except him. He told me, he begged me to stop the construction, but it was too late. The money had been transferred. My name was tied to it, and then someone else knew. Someone who had even more to lose. Who? Margaret closed her eyes. She didn't respond. Do you know what hurts most, Jane? He said finally. That the silence didn't begin with her death. It was there before, and then it only got deeper. Miss Marple, in a very soft voice, said, Secrets in villages don't die. They just change, form, and in that moment they both knew the truth was near. Not because anyone was going to confess it, but because the silence could no longer hold it. Chapter 11. The Echo Under the Stones. Thursday dawned with a dry wind sweeping the church paths and rustling the tablecloths already laid out on the festival tables. Neighbours came and went, tying flowers to the posts, speaking in whispers more out of habit than discretion. Despite their forced enthusiasm, no one could pretend that the crime didn't weigh on Crowston like a stone slab. Miss Marple sat by the window in her living room, scanning the square. She held a piece of paper torn from a notebook, a copy of the old map of the church grounds, which she had obtained from the municipal archives. The rear section, marked additional ceremonial space, was exactly the area where James Eddowes claimed to have found the chain, and right there, according to a note in faded ink, victims of an epidemic had been buried more than a century ago. The discovery wasn't insignificant. If Harold Pembroke had discovered it, he understood why he had wanted to prevent the pavilion's construction. It wasn't just a legal issue, but something deeper. A silent respect for the forgotten dead. It was that respect, Miss Marple thought, that had killed him. In the middle of the morning, Rowntree stopped by her house. His face was more tense than usual. "We have a confession," he announced bluntly. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Whose? James Eddowes? Or at least that's what he tries to appear to be." They sat in the garden. The bougainvillea was just beginning to bloom, but the scent of the damp earth created an almost sacred air. James says Harold caught him checking the foundations of the pavilion grounds. The inspector explained that they argued that Harold threatened to spill the beans, and that he actually pushed him. He says it wasn't intentional, that he hit his head and died. "And then you took him up to the bell tower?" Rowntree looked down. "That's the problem. James doesn't have the strength to move a body up that narrow staircase, nor the key to the trapdoor. But he insists he acted alone." Miss Marple let out a sigh. "And what does Mrs. Redgrave say?" "He's disappeared." That word on Rowntree's lips did not sound like a coincidence. "He's not at home, nor in his office. His minor luggage is missing. He didn't withdraw any money, but he seems to have left a note for his housekeeper. Something vague. I'll come back when everything is clearer." Miss Marple stood up. She went to her oldest, Rosebush, where Harold had once helped her plant a tea graft. "She didn't run away. She just went ahead," he said softly. "She was never an impulsive woman, but she was careful, maybe too careful." Rowntree frowned. "Do you still believe she didn't kill Harold? I'm sure he didn't do it with his own hands, but I'm not so sure he didn't set in motion what killed him. There are crimes committed with words, Inspector, and silences." That afternoon Miss Marple visited the church again. The pews were clean. The organ was covered. The bell rope, still unused, looked like a sleeping viper hanging from the ceiling. She struggled up the steps of the pulpit, from where Harold had so often spoken in a low but firm voice. And there, right where the base of the stairs to the bell tower was, she saw something she had missed. A button. Small, black, with a metal rim, half crushed. She picked it up carefully and held it up to the light filtered through the stained glass windows. It wasn't James's or Harold's uniform, but it did match a coat she'd seen many times. A coat like the one Reverend Ellis wore. That night, Miss Marple went to see him. She knocked on the rectory door just as dusk fell. The Reverend greeted her with a weary expression and invited her into the study, just as he had last time. "There isn't much left to say, is there, Miss Marple?" She didn't respond immediately. She just took the button out of her pocket and placed it on the table. "I found him at the foot of the bell tower stairs." He looked at him for long seconds. He didn't deny it. "Harold showed me the papers," he said finally. "He showed me the records. He knew about the land, and he wanted to reveal it during the festival, to denounce it publicly. He said the dead deserved respect, but I knew what that would do to the town, to the temple, to the faithful who still believe in what this place represents. So he stopped him. I begged him. I told him to wait, that we should talk it over calmly. But Harold, he was more adamant than he let on. He climbed into the bell tower with the key, like every Saturday afternoon. He said he'd ring the bell on Sunday in protest, that he'd reveal everything from the pulpit. The Reverend's eyes filled with something darker than remorse. I followed him. I wasn't thinking of hurting him, just of making him see reason. We argued. He stumbled. He fell. And then I knew silence was the only option left. Miss Marple looked down. She didn't say murder. There was no need to, and that's why he placed his body next to the bell, so that it would ring. Even in silence, Ellis nodded, his eyes on the ground. It was his altar and his tomb. As she left the rectory, Miss Marple noticed the first stars beginning to peek through the clouds. Crowsden was calm, but not peaceful. The bell at St. Mildred's had not yet rung again, but it no longer weighed as much as before. Because, finally, someone had heard what the silence was saying. Chapter 12. What the Bells Didn't Say. On Friday morning, the skies over Crowsden finally opened up. A soft golden light bathed the houses, flower-filled gardens and cobbled lanes, with an air of involuntary rebirth. It was as if the town, after so many days under the cloud of silence, suspicion and fear, could breathe again. But St. Mildred's bell had not yet rung. In the centre of town, the Hydrangea Festival had been reduced to its simplest form. Tables, with poorly arranged cakes, timid flower arrangements, and measured conversations. There was no music, no speeches, just a quiet expectation, as if everyone knew something important still needed to be said. It was close to noon when Miss Marple appeared at the prize table, escorted by Inspector Rowntree. She was dressed in light grey, wearing her usual hat, and had a serene expression that didn't suggest any grand scene. Yet, when she cleared her throat, the whole square seemed to stand still. "Crowsden residents," he said in a firm, though never loud, voice. "There's something we need to clarify. About Harold Pembroke, about his silence, and about what really happened in the bell tower." A murmur arose, but it quickly faded away. For days, we've all guessed. We've looked for culprits among our neighbours, among familiar faces. Some, like James Edhouse, have confessed to acts they didn't commit to protect others. Others have remained silent for too long for fear of scandal. But buried truths don't disappear. Like roots underground, they eventually emerge. Sometimes too late. Miss Marple held up a small sheet of paper. This is an archival record, a forgotten deed found by Harold. It shows that the ground behind the church was consecrated and used for burials during the plague of 1911. Harold discovered that the new pavilion would desecrate that space. Even worse, he knew that part of the funding for its construction came from a donation made in the name of a public figure, with carefully concealed initials. The eyes of those present turned to Mrs. Redgrave, who had just arrived discreetly, dressed and without makeup. She didn't run away. She didn't feign ignorance. She just remained silent, as if she knew her turn would come. Harold tried to stop him, Miss Marple continued. He informed Reverend Ellis. He warned him. He begged him. But the Reverend was afraid it would destroy the parish's reputation, that it would bury his legacy. He tried to convince Harold to keep quiet. When he couldn't, he followed him to the bell tower. There they argued, and Harold fell. There were no gasps, there were no startles, just a bitter stillness. The Reverend didn't act with the intent to kill, Miss Marple added in a lower voice. But then he chose not to call for help. He chose to hide it. He brought the body upstairs. He closed the trapdoor and let the bell fall silent. To protect others, to protect himself. Rowntree stepped forward. Reverend Ellis is now in custody. He has confessed. A sigh ran through the square, like a candle finally extinguished. Mrs. Redgrave took a step towards Miss Marple. Me too. Miss Marple stared at her, with sadness rather than judgment. You didn't kill Harold, but your silence, your insistence on hiding your involvement in the donation, lit the fuse. As often happens in small places, Margaret, the sin isn't the act, but the concealment. The woman lowered her gaze. She didn't cry. She just nodded. I'll do the right thing, he said hoarsely. I'll withdraw the funding. I'll cancel the pavilion. And I'll talk to every family who has relatives buried beneath that plot. They deserve to know. That afternoon, for the first time in almost a week, the bell rope was once again taut. It was Miss Marple who rang it. Once. Alone. The sound, deep and round, rose over the town like a closing note, or perhaps like a call. Not to mass, not to celebration, but to reflection. In her garden that evening, Miss Marple wrote the last line in her flower notebook. Silence only protects the guilty, when no one dares to listen. Then he closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and poured himself a cup of tea. In Crowsden, peace was slowly returning, not as oblivion, but as accepted truth, and the bell, which had been so silent, had finally spoken.